Hey, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Florida Hockey Now podcast, where we will give you weekly updates on the Florida Panthers. We'll have two subscriber exclusive episodes coming to the website every month, starting in October, and there's more to come. But today we have some very big news to talk about, and we have our friend Steve Macfarlane here from Calgary Hockey Now. Say hi.
Hey, Colby. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on as your first guest. I'm honored.
Yeah, it's definitely a big honor, and definitely got some big things to talk about here. The Florida Panthers made a big splash on Friday night, sending longtime franchise star Jonathan Huberdeau, a star defenseman in MacKenzie Weegar, a first-round pick, and prospect Cole Schwindt to the Calgary Flames in exchange for Matthew Tkachuk. It's one that changes the outlook on both franchises, where the Panthers, their window got extended with a 24-year-old coming in to be that guy that can be the face of the franchise. And as we've heard during his introductory press conference yesterday, he's very outspoken. He wants to be in Florida, and he can do about just about anything on the ice. And then on the other end, you have Calgary, who lost Johnny Gaudreau in free agency. Things were kind of tapering off there with how people were looking at them when Matthew Tkachuk all of a sudden says that he wants to get traded. He wants to sign his next contract with a different team. And they have a little bit of an injection of life there with Jonathan Huberdeau, MVP candidate last year, one of the most underrated defensemen in the league, MacKenzie Weegar coming in. So, Steve, what do you think about the trade?
It was a lot to digest, but like when I think about it, I just the line from Dumb and Dumber keeps coming back into mind about GM Brad Treliving totally redeeming himself. It's been a tough offseason in Calgary. Honestly, losing Johnny Gaudreau, there was always a risk, but I think people really believed, especially internally, and other GMs across the league, they really thought that Gaudreau was going back to Calgary. So that was a huge loss and a huge shock, and it kind of set the fan base into a tailspin, and I think the franchise as well. So their next focus was, all right, let's get Matthew Tkachuk. He can be the face of the franchise. He's a future captain. They've been talking about it for a couple of years, and it's a guy who, like you said, he can do it all. Uh, he's in the fabric of the game. He's in the corners. He's so talented offensively, and I think that still gets underplayed because of his sort of pest mentality and his ability to mix it up too. But the things he does and the goals he scores between the legs, him and Gaudreau were just incredible together. Such fantastic playmakers. They did the things where Gaudreau would try to do the lacrosse pass from behind the net like Zegras successfully completed with Milano, and they were the future of the franchise, and then they were gone like that quickly, within a week of each other. The news that Tkachuk had decided not to sign a long-term deal. He was ready to sign his qualifying offer, but he let them know that his intention was to do the 1-year deal. So, he did, in leaving, give them an opportunity to get something back. I don't think anybody expected to get back what the Flames got back. Um, Contracts aside, I know that both those star players that you mentioned, and Huberdeau jumps right into Gaudreau's vacant spot on the left side, can play with Elias Lindholm on the top line, who's probably very similar to Barkov in terms of the way they play the 200-foot game, and also very underrated, I think, in the league for all that they do. Although that's changing, it certainly has changed for Barkov. I think that has started to change with Lindholm as well, and will probably take another giant leap forward with Huberdeau on his wing, just for all that he can do as a playmaker. And honestly, it just gave new life to this franchise. It was, things were looking so bleak. It was, are we rebuilding now? What do we do? And now it's like we've got Huberdeau here. MacKenzie Weegar is an incredible defenseman who, you said it, super underrated. I think that he's going to get a little bit more of that that focus up in a Canadian market where people are going to start to see him on those Saturday nights and appreciate all that he does in both ends. And it may just be for 1 year. We don't know what the future holds in terms of signing. They both said they're open to it, but just buys time for the Flames to figure out what their next move is and keeps them competitive. So could be some hard decisions down the road, but right now it just kind of gave the whole city a jolt of electricity to get back into hockey after feeling pretty down for a couple of, well, more than a couple of weeks, because it goes right back to losing to their most hated rival in the playoffs, the Edmonton Oilers there. So it's been dark times since the end of the season in Calgary, and this week just kind of gave them some light.
Yeah, and then just looking at what Brad Treliving said, that Calgary was receiving some gut punches in the media over the last couple of weeks with Gaudreau wanting out and leaving and Tkachuk leaving. Does a move like this, especially when you have guys like Jonathan Huberdeau and MacKenzie Weegar, kind of make that feeling a little bit lessened?
Yeah, I think what it does is it keeps them in the market for free agency. When you lose a guy like Gaudreau who chose Columbus, which, shocked the NHL in terms of a location for a number of reasons. No disrespect to Columbus. It's a great franchise, and they have some really attractive pieces, but I don't think anyone expected Gaudreau to choose the Blue Jackets over the other options, including Calgary. So it didn't, and then Tkachuk adding to that and saying he didn't want to sign here. There was a sort of sentiment that, like, is Calgary a location where people are going to want to go? Could they bring a guy like Kadri in, or would he look at the city and the team and say, no, it's not competitive enough, and it's maybe a place that other people aren't sticking around, so maybe there's a reason for it. There are cold winters here, but the city itself is an attractive place. I think it may be more attractive to Canadians. Huberdeau and Weegar both, being from north of the border, seem to have a little bit more of a taste for what's to come. But it's going to be a bit of a shock to the system after playing in South Florida and wearing flip-flops and enjoying all of that. So yeah, I do think that bringing those guys in makes Calgary more attractive to others. And I don't think Brad Treliving is done making moves. He's going to keep looking at free agents. I think I wouldn't be surprised if they're still kicking the tires on Kadri and trying to make a splash in replacing Tkachuk, because they've essentially replaced Gaudreau, but they're still 100 point forward down with Tkachuk leaving. So the work is not yet done, and bringing in guys of that caliber definitely helps with that next step.
Yeah, looking at a team like Calgary, it reminds me of where the New York Islanders were after John Tavares left, where
Yeah.
they had a coach in Barry Trotz who had a very good defensive system and was able to, even without their stars, build something where they're able to make the conference finals 2 years in a row, have a talented group. And looking at the Flames team that they have right now, they have a better decor than the Islanders did back then, and they already have a little bit more firepower on offense than those Islanders teams as well. So I think there really is a chance for the Flames to be competitive, even if they don't make a move. Well, what are your thoughts on this current roster?
Yeah, I mean, they've got Daryl Sutter, who's coming off a Jack Adams year, and he really brought that group together systems-wise. He gave them a structure that they haven't been playing with for maybe as long as his previous time here as head coach, or at least as GM. They kind of lost their identity, and they really found that again this year. Um, I think that they can be very competitive as long as they stick to the sort of system and the things that they were building on last year. That defensive group, oh man, it might be one of the best in the league now. It played pretty well last year as a group. A lot of young guys, Rasmus Anderson and Noah Hannafin as a top pairing, still sort of showed a few of those warts in the playoffs, especially. But they're just getting better and better. Chris Tanev is such an amazing defensive defenseman, and also had a career year offensively last year. depending on how quickly he's back from his surgery on his torn labrum, he may miss a little bit of time, or at least come in maybe not at his top level after camp. But Weegar just, automatically gives him someone who could play on any pairing. He could play on the top pairing. He could be a power play guy. I think he gives them so much depth now. It's going to be a defensive group to be reckoned with, on both sides of the puck. I think they can put up a lot of points. They almost had two 50-point defensemen last year. Anderson hit it, and Hannafin was too shy. Weegar gives him another guy who's going to come in, and who knows what he can do depending on his usage, right? We're going to find out. But to have a top four and then Oliver Shillington behind them, Nikita Zadorov, a few other guys, a couple of new guys were brought in on one-year deals for depth, and we still have Juuso Välimäki, who's a top prospect who's maybe lost a little bit of luster, but still competitive, and he'll be fighting for that seventh role. All the guys are fighting for a seventh role now because the top six is so established. That is a key to this group's success. Jacob Markstrom in goal. Just not even looking at the forwards. If they just have an average year offensively, which I don't think they're going to have now that they've got Huberdeau in there, but even an average year offensively can still win this team a lot of one-goal games if they're playing that structure and they're getting good goaltending. And I think they have to be one of the favorites to repeat in the Pacific, even without filling that Tkachuk role that's vacant. And I think they're still trying to do that because I think they know that their window is still short. It's still small. They might be growing on defense. They do have a lot of good young players, but their window right now, unless they have Huberdeau locked up to a longer term deal, it's still a win now sort of mentality.
Yeah, for sure. And MacKenzie Weegar is definitely a guy that changes the outlook of a defense core as well, with even more so on top of the foundation they have. Like MacKenzie Weegar's a guy for the last couple years stepped in and played some very good hockey and kept the Panthers afloat while Aaron Ekblad was dealing with injuries and out for the end of the season, both last season and the season before. And he's absolutely a guy who can be a number one defenseman. He's a guy that moves the puck pretty well. He's aggressive, makes plays, and he can even change the outlook of how the offense operates as well on top of his defensive abilities. And while there is the caveat to his aggressiveness that he makes turnovers sometimes, and that was something that Florida fans definitely made a point to tweet about every time I hopped on Twitter. Everyone's like, trade Weegar for making a mistake over there in the playoffs. But he's the type of guy that really gets aggressive and can help the transition game. And that's something the Flames definitely could use when losing a guy like Johnny Gaudreau, who was an excellent puck carrier, made plays on his own. Same thing with a guy like Matthew Tkachuk, who could do just about anything, and we'll get more into him in a second. But a guy like MacKenzie Weegar really changes your franchise.
He does, and I think those mistakes, he'll be given sort of the luxury of being creative here. The Sutter system is often called a defensive system, but it's really more than that. It's sort of that checking. He always corrects people here in Calgary, calls it, it's not defense, it's checking. So it really refers to everybody being in the right place, doing the right thing, being on the right side of the puck. But you can still be creative. You can still make those creative rushes or breakout passes from the back end. And if you make a mistake, that's okay, but it's kind of a don't make the same mistake twice attitude from Sutter. So if you continuously do the same things in that aggressive manner, then you'll probably be called on it, and you'll lose a little ice time or get yelled at in the locker room or whatever. But it'll make them better, and making MacKenzie Weegar better is scary because he's already pretty darn good.
And then you look at a guy like Jonathan Huberdeau. He, over the last couple seasons, made it a point to become better defensively and become more of an aggressive checking forward. And Well, it's still slowly making progress, and he had some penalty kill time. He had some pretty good scoring chances on the penalty kill even, and he also made some pretty big plays on the penalty kill. There's still a little bit of mixed results sometimes, but getting a guy like that in Daryl Sutter's system, where you already kind of see the buy-in to that system before he even gets there, what can that do for Huberdeau's game?
Well, if you just look at Johnny Gaudreau before Sutter and Johnny Gaudreau after Sutter, um, the difference is pretty impressive. And a lot of people said, well, maybe he didn't like playing under Sutter. Maybe that's part of the reason he left. I don't buy any of that. I think he loved Sutter. He said he loved Sutter. Tkachuk said the same thing, and I think they really mean it. I mean, he's a different kind of coach, but he's not the coach he was before. He knows how to talk to the players. He knows how to get the best results. And Johnny Gaudreau, all year long, Sutter said the same thing, that this guy is their best 200-foot player, and he has to be. And, I can't remember seeing Johnny Gaudreau back check the way he did this year in any previous years. It would happen occasionally. And, I wouldn't say he was always floating or cheating or any of that, but the difference this year was his determination to come back and be on the right side of the puck and lift a stick or make a play. It was outstanding. It's the reason that he finished fourth in the Hart Trophy voting. It was the points, the 115 points, which Huberdeau had the same, and I think Huberdeau finished fifth in the Hart Trophy voting, right behind Gaudreau, if I'm not mistaken. It was that the reason he got that attention, and the reason he got those points was because of his efforts on the other side of the puck. So that possession and that transition and that back checking to get the puck back and keep that puck on their sticks was the biggest piece of the Flames' success last year. And Gaudreau, honestly, he was the guy who made that happen. And I don't know that anyone saw that coming in terms of his connection and his, I guess, partnership with Sutter and ability to become that good a player. But that's what we saw, and that's why he ultimately had his choice to go anywhere and had so many people after him was because of what a well-rounded player he became. Obviously, the points are flashy and huge, but it was because of the way he played the game and how determined he was to get that puck back this year that he was such a dynamic player.
And then just shifting over to the Florida side of the trade here, what kind of growth have you seen from Matthew Tkachuk under Daryl Sutter, where it kind of opened up his game a little bit to become that kind of unicorn player where he's really well-rounded to the point where he can play in the defensive zone and get those defensive zone starts? Is that something you've kind of seen from him?
Yeah, similar to Gaudreau in terms of just the way that the coach preaches the game and teaches the game. But with Tkachuk, it's interesting. I'm really curious to see how he's used by Florida in terms of where he can be in the lineup. He was a left winger his whole career, and then he got flipped to the right wing last year by Sutter to be full time on that top line. He experimented with it a little bit the previous season after he came over and coached at the end of the year, and liked that combination. And flipping Matthew to the right side just kind of changed a little bit of his perspective of how he sees the ice and the ability to make those plays on his off wing, off shooting wing. Gave him a better angles on the puck. It really made a huge difference, and I think gave him the confidence now to be that top offensive player as well, not maybe just a secondary piece of it who scores a lot of power play goals, but someone who can be a 100-point player with the right talent around him. It made a huge difference for Matthew as well, and I think he would probably give a lot of credit to Sutter for giving him that opportunity and opening up that part of his game and being a multi-position player. I know a lot of players have had troubles, flipping back and forth, but I don't think Matthew has that trouble.
So it almost seems kind of what happened with Alex Ovechkin at the beginning of his career when, or not the beginning of his career, when I think it was Barry Trotz who flipped him over to the left wing, and it really opened up his game where he found that spot where he lit up those one-timers and
Mm-hmm.
also turned him into more of a physical player as well. Is that kind of the vibe you're getting here with Matthew Tkachuk?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that a lot of teams try on the power play specifically, right? Like to get them in different sort of positions and angles for shooting, and it makes it tougher on the goalie to sort of figure out where the puck is going to go off the stick. And with Matthew, it really just it's a hard thing to do when you're picking up pucks along the boards or you know from a different angle than you'd receive a pass than you would on your natural wing. So it is a tough adjustment, and not all players can do it. Obviously, Ovechkin is capable of something like that, and Tkachuk is right there at that level of talent and vision. The way he sees the ice, it actually allows you to see the ice a little better. You just have to be someone who's willing to get a little mucky along the boards to play that off wing, and for sure, Tkachuk is not about to shy away from that kind of play, as we all know.
And something we saw in Florida a lot is that the Panthers liked splitting up Jonathan Huberdeau and Alexander Barkov, which made
Hmm.
Sam Bennett the primary center that Jonathan Huberdeau played with last year. And Sam Bennett's also a guy that Matthew Tkachuk played with. I mean, what kinds of things did you see from the two players when they were playing together while they were in Calgary?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Huberdeau brought out the best in Sam Bennett. I think when he was in Calgary, he was very good in sort of limited windows where you'd see the potential and you'd see the talent and you'd see the desire. And then other times it would just be sort of a frustration level here that really brought out that fresh start in Florida. And I think a lot of that was due to sort of the pressure he put on himself, and the fresh start probably helped. But then I think playing with Huberdeau really brought that to the forefront during the regular season, not just in the playoffs, where I think the game suited him a little bit more. He liked to get a little dirtier and mix it up a little bit more. Tkachuk and Bennett together in Calgary had some success. Um, I guess that just gives them another option in terms of who they play him with, and I think he would fit in really well with Barkov, and they complement each other in sort of the same way that Lindholm and Tkachuk complemented each other. They're both shooters. They can both take the shot, but their sort of playmaking skills are underrated. So you never know who's going to actually end up taking the shot. And if you have Bennett and you have Tkachuk together, you have two very physical players who just aren't fun to play against, who can also bury the puck no problem if they get that opportunity. So a lot of options in Florida. I'm really curious to see how they mix it up and if they experiment in the preseason with Tkachuk on either wing. And I don't know the depth chart as well as I know Calgary, so um, I kind of know how it looks at center. I don't know how they want to mix it up at wing, and whether or not they want to put Tkachuk on the left side after losing Huberdeau, or if they want to kind of keep things rolling the way Sutter had things going with him on the right side. But lots of options, and I'm sure he'll be successful no matter where he goes.
Yeah, there are a lot of options Florida can go with. Like, if Florida decide to put Kachuk on the first line, they can put him on the right side of Barkov and Carter Verhaeghe. And I mean, as you're talking about with Verhaeghe, with Barkov and Kachuk, Verhaeghe's a little bit of a speed guy, but he presents the ability to shot, and he'll make some plays as well. So that gives you a first line of three different guys who can shoot the puck, pass the puck. You don't know where the shots coming from, and that's something Florida did with putting with Anthony Duclair on that top line as well during the season. Anthony Duclair is not going to be playing until at least February
Yeah.
from what we're seeing. So Matthew Tkachuk slides in there, and that's a line they can put together. Or you look to the second line where you can put him with a guy like Sam Bennett, and there are a lot of options. Um, Not as good options as last season with guys like Mason Marchment and Claude Giroux, and even a guy like Maxime Mammon leaving. You have a field of guys between Rudolph Balsers, Colin White, and Nick Cousins who get under the other team's skin a little bit in some cases, play a little bit of a checking game, and can play in the defensive zone a little bit, but haven't necessarily shown that offensive punch. And I mean, it's a little bit concerning comparing a guy like that with Sam Bennett and Matthew Tkachuk. Although Tkachuk is a guy that has shown at some points that he can carry a line and he can do all sorts of things, but you'd want to have a guy that can carry the puck and make a pass over to Tkachuk, and I'm not necessarily sure if you get that. Maybe if you separate Sam Reinhart and Anton Lundell, maybe you do that, but you're also sacrificing some talent that you'd be putting with Anton Lundell. But there's a lot of interesting things, and the Panthers have some younger guys that can slide in. Like they've signed Anton Levchi from Finland. He led the Elite League in scoring at 61 points in 55 games. So there are some options there. Not too sure how good some of them are, but it's a wait and see thing.
Yeah, and that's similar here in Calgary, I think, in terms of who plays with who. People are talking about Huberdeau sliding right in where Gaudreau was beside Elias Lindholm, but there are definitely some options there. There are other players, and they're going to have to find the right sort of pairings and then fill in the line with the third guy. There's a lot of experimentation that can be done, I think, and we'll see what Daryl Sutter decides to do in training camp.
Yeah, and then just going back to Kachuk a little bit more, we've talked about his on ice impact, but I mean the off ice impact he provides to Florida is very impactful as well. I mean, as he was talking about in his press conference yesterday, I mean he wants to be a guy that can be outspoken and make sure that nobody can go without seeing a Panther player and being like, yeah, that's a Panther player. So, and he's a guy that likes to talk a lot of trash. He already kind of threw some shots at Tampa over the last couple days. He wants to get into those rivalries. He's a guy that wants to be there for a long time. I mean, how can a guy like that help out the Florida market?
I think I think I read a lot about it already. He sort of says he brings that swagger. Definitely doesn't lack for confidence. I mean, how often do 24-year-olds have such an impact on their own trade and sort of, he's very strategic. When he signed his deal 3 years ago, he took the bridge deal because he knew that this was a point of his career where he was going to want to make some choices and decide if he saw his future in Calgary or if he wanted to go somewhere else and sort of restart a legacy. And, he's matured so much, even from last year to this past year, from the year previous. Um, he was out there all the time with the media, that he was answering every question. He wasn't showing the same sort of frustration as you can often experience in the Canadian market with so many outlets and clips that people are looking for, and that could be frustrating at times, especially when things weren't going well for that team in the previous season. This year things went much better for the team, but I think it didn't really matter if it was a good season or a bad season. Tkachuk was there. He was wearing a letter, talked about as a future captain, and he really owned that role. And I think that's something down there. You have a captain. You have a captain for the entire term of Tkachuk's contract. That's a spot where he might be the guy who jumps in, or whenever Barkov decides to retire, or if he's ever departing the team for another reason, like you've got a guy that is ready for it. And even if he doesn't have that letter, he's going to be one of those important leadership guys in your room, who's not afraid to say something. He's not afraid to call it a teammate. He's not afraid to give a motivational speech. He's not afraid to tell more of the truth on the podium or in the locker room or wherever you guys are able to do your interviews this year. You're going to have a guy who speaks the truth more often than not. And fans here might say he wasn't speaking the truth when he said he was open to signing a long-term deal in Calgary at the end of the year. But I do think, and I've written that I think he believed that at the time. He just wasn't sure yet, and it wasn't until he got that opportunity as a restricted free agent to start talking to other teams that sort of changed his mentality. And I also think that the Gaudreau departure, as much as everyone says that it had nothing to do with it, how could it not? You watch a guy like that leave your team, and you're assessing your team for the next year. It's not better. So I think that factored into his decision as well a little bit. But I don't think he wanted to throw his teammate under the bus at all. And I think that's part of the reason for disputing that so heavily was to make sure everyone understood it was his decision and not something that they had talked about previously, that they were both going to be leaving.
And you've been around Matthew Tkachuk for a while. He's been in Calgary since 2016. What kind of story just kind of sums up everything he brings to the table? Like, I've seen him get into it with Zach Kassian, and that was a big headline. But what's just one big story that kind of sums up what Florida's getting?
I mean, it's tough to find one, but I do think those rivalries, so with Kassian to a certain degree, but the Drew Doughty rivalry was an incredible one. And they ended up getting asked about each other before every game that the Kings and Flames would play, and they'd be willing to get into a little bit of a verbal battle, but then they backed it up on the ice every single time. They just played so hard against each other, and I think that's where Tkachuk's sort of shenanigans come into play. It's not out of a need to gain attention or a need to provoke other people. Like, I don't even know. He does talk some trash on the ice. He'll say he doesn't really talk trash, but he talks trash. But the way he does it, and it's always backed up by that sort of physical play. It's all about competing and just being engaged in every minute of a game. So I think those battles that will come, especially against teams like Tampa, when those rivalry games come, you're getting a guy who plays like he's in a rivalry game for most games. And I know you can't really sustain that for an entire season, but you're getting a higher percentage out of Tkachuk than you're getting out of most players in terms of that competitive nature on the ice. You're getting somebody who looks forward to going into the corners and laying a hit, which creates that space to do the offensive magic that he's also capable of doing. So he's just such a well-rounded player with such a high drive to be successful and to be competitive. I think that Florida's just going to love having him on their team.
Yeah, and then, like you said, he backs it up, and it's something that South Florida really thrives on building a fan base for. Like, you look at the Miami Hurricanes that talked a lot of trash and brought some swagger during the 1980s. I wasn't even alive when this was happening, but talking to people about it and watching documentaries about it, that's what kind of built a culture down in South Florida. And then you got the Miami Heat with their culture and the swagger that was brought with Dwayne Wade and Shaquille O'Neal winning a championship in 06, and then LeBron wanting to be a part of that and coming down. It's something that kind of is built in South Florida, and it's something that the Panthers haven't necessarily tapped. Like, Jonathan Huberdeau and Sasha Barkov has been their two best players in franchise history, and they haven't necessarily had anyone before that really brought much. But with Barkov and Huberdeau, they both had this really quiet style of confidence. Huberdeau, you kind of caught having fun a little bit in South Florida, and he's a guy that likes to have fun, but he's not necessarily the most outspoken guy that will kind of get things going and get people fired up for something. And
Yeah.
Sasha Barkov is, well, sometimes you can get Barkov making you laugh. And Barkov's made us laugh a couple times last season where he's an underratedly funny guy, but he's a very humble guy. He's quiet, but also has that confidence, and he's that type of guy that leads by example, and that's how you kind of set the tone for your room there,
Hmm.
and how to be that kind of quiet, confident team that will show it all on the ice. But Matthew Tkachuk's that type of guy that can inject life into a rivalry and get things going with Tampa. Like you saw that kind of thing go between the two last year. But I mean, as far as quotes go, you just have a couple guys saying, "Oh, there's definitely a rivalry there, and we don't like these guys," but not necessarily any other kind of shot. And they're more kind of respectful, which I like out of these guys. They're not trying to offend anybody. They're good people. But you get a guy like Matthew Tkachuk out there who he's not afraid to tell things how they are as well. I think that's something that a lot of people in South Florida would really like out of that guy.
Well, you've already got him saying he hates Tampa more than he hates Edmonton, right? Now that he's injected into that rivalry. So you know what you're gonna see out of them when those two teams play for sure. I think the sort of interesting thing of bringing a guy like Kachuk in, 24 years old, um, kind of says a lot about where Zito wants to go with the team, and he wants to bring that swagger in. The curious thing for me is going to be, how is he received in that room? How, do people jump in and follow along and sort of feed off of that swagger and buy into that swagger? Like Sam Bennett, I think probably will, and they'll already have had that close relationship. So, you know, he'll sort of gravitate towards that. Will Barkov, will that be a good relationship um, where they can be very different but be on the same page and sort of change the way the team is perceived, or I guess evolve a little bit more into a more outwardly and vocally confident team? My guess is that Zito is looking at the playoffs and looking at the sort of lack of success they had this year after such a successful regular season, and thinking that Kachuk is the kind of guy he wants to come in and help change that. But you really do need the other players to buy in, and I think there might have been some struggles with that in the past in Calgary a couple years ago, and I think it was made worse by the pandemic, and the locker room was a little bit more divided, or not completely on the same page. But last year it came together in a way that I haven't seen in a long time, and it's a little bit more from afar because we're not in the locker room anymore. It's podium interviews, and you don't see all the dynamics that you used to see. But every indication last year was that the Calgary Flames, uh, were as close as they've been in a number of years. And I think with a guy like Kachuk, that's an important thing, that they're all on the same page and they all have that understanding of what each person brings, regardless of how different they are, and that it rubs off in the positive way, with that energy and with that swagger, as opposed to the potential for a quiet player thinking that it's too much or too flashy or too outspoken. So those are the dynamics that I'll be watching, with a curious sort of eye on for how that fit is.
Yeah, and like you look at how Florida was last year, they were as close as you possibly could get. Any new player that went into that locker room was accepted, and they were put right into the fold. But when you're kind of changing the dynamic there with a guy like Jonathan Huberdeau leaving, a guy that a lot of people liked in Mason Marchment leaving, Claude Giroux kind of making appearance there, kind of getting some guys going, and then all of a sudden now he's gone too. There's a kind of a different dynamic there, and while you still have a lot of your vocal guys there with Ryan Lomberg, another guy that Matthew Tkachuk has played with, Patrick Hornquist, another vocal leader, still there, and it's probably that could be a curious reason as to why Florida hasn't moved him, because he is that kind of glue guy they have there that has kept that room together. He's one of the more vocal guys in that room, and the guy that gets a lot of people going. And you think maybe having a guy like that can kind of help a transition like this happen, but it's kind of interesting to see where you have a locker room that's been as close as it's ever been in the last few years, and all of a sudden you take away one of the biggest leaders in Jonathan Huberdeau, and you replace him with a guy that is a little bit more outspoken, carries a swagger with him, and he's not too cocky. And he says whenever he says something, he has reason to back it up with. But it does present a little bit of a question.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I'm definitely interested in seeing how that all plays out. And it's not too different in Calgary. Like, is Calgary going to come together now, losing those two 100-point players, and rally around the guys that they got back and welcome them in, and find a way to sort of take that winning mentality from last year and say we're just as good as last year, and sort of get that belief going early, rather than sort of licking their wounds from losing the guys that they did lose. So I think that's another reason this trade, sort of bringing it back to the beginning, that's why this trade was so important, to regardless of what happens, whether or not they sign long term. It's already a win in terms of the short term, and changing the perspective from something really negative to something with some hope.
All right, before I wrap up, I just want to ask one last question, and we can debate here a little bit. Which of these two teams won the trade? Was it Calgary getting Jonathan Huberdeau, MacKenzie Weegar, Cole Schwindt, and a first? Or is it the Panthers getting a lot younger with a guy like Matthew Tkachuk?
It's so hard to really evaluate a trade quickly, like after the fact, because so many elements go into it. To me, if the Flames lock up one or both of Huberdeau or Weegar, I feel like they've won the trade. But I mean, Tkachuk could go on to be a perennial 100-point guy, lead them potentially to some Stanley Cup appearances or whatever, and it's easy to say that Florida's the winner. So it really challenging. I think in terms of contracts aside, if you're just looking at the names that were exchanged, I'd give it for sure to Calgary right now for this season, but long term I would give it to Florida. So I don't know if that's copping out at all, but it's kind of how I see it right now. I think Calgary could be in a very awkward position come trade deadline if they're first in the Pacific again. Neither of those guys is committed to Calgary long term. They're looking at going to unrestricted free agency, and Calgary has to make a decision now where do they flip them and get more assets, even if they're a competitive team, because they were burned by Gaudreau last year, or do they hang on to them because trying to go for that Stanley Cup is more important than sort of that asset management? Are they just happy that they have the first round pick and the prospect in Cole, which I think he's a good prospect as well. So it's going to be really interesting as we sort of grade this over the next year or so.
Yeah, there are a lot of different things that go into who wins a trade, and one of them, the most important, is if one of these teams wins the Stanley Cup with what they got, they ultimately win the trade. And that's something we don't know yet, so that's something that either one of us can get burned on if we make a take here. But if we look at kind of the other factors that go into it, I think Florida also gained a lot of cap flexibility for the future with this, because if you're looking at what Huberdeau and Weegar wanted, they were both asking for a fair amount of money, and on Huberdeau's side, he was looking at $10 to $11 million and for 8 years, and paying a guy that's nearing 30 that amount of money for 8 years, you might get burned if he kind of falls off near the last 4 years of that deal, and all of a sudden you're stuck paying a guy $11 million, and he's starting to crack maybe only 50 points if his game starts to slow down. Maybe that's an area that they could have gotten burned there if they were to negotiate that contract. And same thing, paying a defenseman near 30, like about $7 or $8 million potentially for 8 years, and all of a sudden he starts to slow down, and you start to see some of the same issues the Panthers saw with Keith Yandle where his defensive game went completely out the window and he's making a lot more mistakes than he does good plays, where he was valuable towards the end of his contract as a power play quarterback, but he loses a lot of value on defense and he's almost unplayable in that sense. And you're paying the guy about $5 to $6 million in Keith Yandel's case. So that opens up Florida's door to bring in younger pieces that will help extend that window, and you're paying less for a guy like Matthew Tkachuk. So if you kind of look at it contractually, where, I mean, Calgary gets a year of Huberdeau and Weegar on some really cheap deals.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something where this year it benefits Calgary a lot to go all in and win now with those two pieces, be able to bring in another player with those two players on a cheap deal. But then after you sign them to extensions, if Calgary does extend them, then that kind of puts them in a little bit of a pickle cap-wise as well. So if you're looking cap numbers wise, I think Florida definitely gets a better player than what Huberdeau was, and it also gets cap flexibility. So you look at that, Florida definitely has a lot more options on the table to potentially win the trade. But you look at what Calgary got in return, they got a lot. And if they're able to keep that core around, then all of a sudden you're looking at Calgary won this trade.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's going to depend on who gets that cup first.
Or who wins the most cups too. We've seen with some of these trades.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if they don't figure out a way to keep Huberdeau around or replace him in a potential deal down the road, it'll be pretty tough. They gotta have at least one dynamic forward in that group that can make those kinds of plays.
For sure. Thanks for coming on today. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Florida Hockey Now, or subscribe on your favorite podcast listening, wherever you're listening, Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe. And also buy a subscription to Florida Hockey Now Plus. We'll give you all of the details you guys want on your Florida Panthers. Starting in October, you're going to get 2 of these episodes for free with your subscription. You're going to get subscriber exclusive content there. So be sure to subscribe there as well. And also, you can find Steve at calgaryhockeynow.com, and you get your Calgary Flames news as well.
Yeah, thanks, Colby. Appreciate you having me on. We'll talk more.
Yeah, we'll talk more. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Cheers.